Welcome to this session, which is run jointly by the Nuffield Trust and Sheffield University's Centre for International Research on Care, Labour and Equalities. Today we're going to be discussing social care and reflecting on what we might learn from other countries as we consider what a sustainable social care system could look like in England. Now, social care at the moment is a very prominent issue in our national debate as we all grapple with the COVID-19 crisis. COVID-19 has certainly put extra pressure on the social care system, but I think what it's really done is just highlighted the pressures and problems that already existed. Now, reform of social care has been regularly discussed over the last 2 decades, but real change has failed to materialise. The system in England is widely considered to be underfunded, unfair in that costs often fall on the individual. It's variable across the country in terms of what you're eligible for and what you can access. We have high numbers of vacancies and a high turnover in the workforce, and we have a fragile provider market. And the system is struggling to provide the needs. The system is struggling to meet the needs of our growing population. And increasingly what we're seeing in more and more unpaid carers filling in the gaps, looking after friends and family. Today, we want to shift our focus from problems in the system towards solutions and reflect on what other countries have done and what we might be able to learn from them. I'm delighted to welcome our panel of 5 experts. We'll be hearing from 3 speakers who I'll introduce in a moment. And we've picked 3 key topics that we want to focus on: the funding of social care, workforce and unpaid carers. And then we're going to hear a response from 2 of our panelists. And then we'll move into a brief Q&A. So without much further ado, I will introduce you to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Laura Schlepper, who is a researcher at the Nuffield Trust. She joined in 2018, but hails originally from Germany. In her career, she's worked on a number of issues, including child and adolescent mental health, the gender pay gap and social care. She's contributed to our work looking at funding options for social care, and she's a co-author on the report we did about Germany's long-term care system. Today, she's going to be looking at Germany and how it funds its long-term care system and asks, what can England learn from Germany's experience? Thank you, Laura.
Okay. Thank you, Natasha. So I'll start by giving a quick overview of the English context. So here, social care is funded by local authorities through a combination of a central government fund and local revenue-raising mechanisms, such as council tax. However, national funding is not ring-fenced, which means that local authorities can decide how much of their budget they can and want to allocate to social care. And social care is means tested, and we currently have a threshold of £23,000. So people who have assets that are greater than that threshold don't receive any form of state support and have to fully self-fund their social care needs. And there's also a needs test, and eligibility is high and it keeps rising, which means that only those with highest needs and lowest means are helped under the current system. Okay, next slide. Thanks. There are many challenges with the current system of funding. While needs are rising, a decade of austerity has seen budgets reduced. And in fact, funding for local authorities has halved in real terms since 2010. So we're now facing a significant funding gap for social care of £1.5 billion, which is projected to increase significantly by 2030. And many have to self-fund, and 1 in 10 people face catastrophic costs of more than £100,000 in their lifetime to fund their social care needs. And we've seen a large decline in the numbers of older people able to access local authority-funded care while demand is rising. And providers are reported to be handing back contracts and closing services as they can no longer sustain themselves. Next slide. So we're not alone in facing the challenge of rising social care needs, but we are one of the few developed nations that hasn't yet reformed its social care system. And Germany has successfully reformed its system 30 years ago, and it is often pointed at as an example for England. Hence, we've been looking at Germany. Germany is an interesting example as its demographic projections are much more challenging than ours. And by the way, just to note that, of course, the debate is not limited to older people. And of course, social care, there's also social care for the working age population, but population projections help us to frame the debate and highlight the scale and the urgency of the problem. Next slide. Our populations are not just aging, but in fact, the working age population is also shrinking relative to the older population, which has important implications for how we fund care, because there will be more older people per working age adults. And another reason to look at Germany is that it has demonstrated that it's possible to achieve radical policy reform and shift from one funding system to another quite successfully. Not only that, but if you look at the graph, Germany has been able to increase access to its social care system over time, whereas in England it has actually declined. So to give a bit of background information, Germany introduced a social insurance-based system in 1995 following 20 years of intense debate. And what made reform possible in the end was a variety of factors. Previously, the situation was similar to England. People had to self-fund, and those with lowest or depleted means could apply for social assistance funded through local authorities. And then with demographic change, more and more people relied on social assistance, which increased burden on local authorities, who at the same time had to face new costs through reunification, which happened in the early 90s. And there was also widespread public discontent about the lack of care and the costs of care. So many fell into poverty and had to rely on social assistance to fund their care, despite having worked their whole lives, which led to increasing dissatisfaction among the public. And so there was growing public pressure for change, and reforming social care actually became a vote winner. And there was an incentive for politicians to work together. And interestingly, there was severe political and economic upheaval in Germany because of reunification. There was high unemployment and a recession, and that actually opened a window of opportunity. And it ushered new political discourse and pushed to the forefront some of the social issues, such as social care. And that was the catalyst for change. And what Germany did was to, it started in a similar place to England, but it went about reforming the building blocks of its social care system, and it then adjusted those over time. And there are a couple of principles they built their funding system on. So the first one is that it's a collective funding system, in that it pools risk and across society, so that individuals are protected from catastrophic costs, at least to some extent, but I'll come to that later. And everyone pays in from the age of 23, and intergenerational fairness is addressed in that retired people continue to pay in, and those without children have to pay an additional 0.25% into the social care fund. And the government tried to make it a transparent system so that people could see where their contributions were going. And this was felt to be important in gaining public support. Contributions are administered by publicly owned arm's length bodies, and funding is strictly ring-fenced. So the government can either top it up or take funds out. So it scores highly on transparency, but it does make the system quite inflexible. It's consistent in that anyone can be assessed for needs using national criteria, and everyone gets the same monthly benefits according to their need. And there's clarity about how much people are paying in, because contributions are paid monthly out of pay packets at a fixed proportion. And that also means that those that earn more also pay in more. And funding to providers is stable, with providers being paid via a fee schedule that's regularly negotiated. There are, however, questions as to the long-term sustainability of the system. With the intention to balance individual and state responsibility, and in order to contain costs of the system, care costs are only partially covered, and people are expected to contribute to costs out of pocket. This means that people can still face large costs, and at the minute it's about 50% of care costs that are actually paid by individuals out of pocket. And this means that with increasing care needs, it means that both premiums and out-of-pocket care costs have increased over time, as you can see from those graphs. They keep rising. And another problem is that because it's based on income-only revenue and it's strictly ring-fenced, it's quite inflexible. It cannot be topped up or diverted. And this makes it quite sensitive to changes in the economy, for example. In order to ensure sustainability from the outset, the system has built up reserves to balance susceptibility to changes in the economy and wider social policy as well as allow for widening of access over time, as you can see from the graph here. However, it wasn't always enough, and the system has run into deficits, and out-of-pocket costs keep rising. So there are a couple of proposals to ensure sustainability, and one that's of particular significance to us is the attempt to introduce private supplementary insurance to cover the individual costs. And that was something that's always been available, but uptake has traditionally been quite low. And in 2012, the government tried to boost uptake of private insurance to address this problem by offering subsidies for uptake, but it didn't really kick off. And so the idea of private insurance has actually been abandoned since, and they've been looking at alternatives such as setting up a reserve fund that will be built up over the next 15, 20 years, and it will be available once the baby boom generation hits retirement to help sort of cushion for the effect of that, so they don't have to increase premiums endlessly. And there are also currently live discussions regarding introduction of a cap on costs, similar to the discussions led here in England. So yeah, what could actually work in England? The question is whether the German system would work here. And of course, we can't just drag and drop the whole system, because reforms need to be embedded in our social values and contexts. But there are certain principles we identified that could form the basis of a system here. And first of all, it's fairness. There needs to be a system that spreads risk across society and removes the risk of catastrophic costs falling on individuals. And while social insurance is an unfamiliar system in England, what could potentially work here is a system like general taxation, which is familiar through funding for the NHS. And in terms of transparency, that element helped to gain public support in Germany. And it was aided by designing a system around monthly contributions and monthly benefits, so people can see what they put in and what they get out. And then implementing consistency through national frameworks across the country takes away the feeling that any variation is unfair, and again, it helps build public support. And then lastly, we need to design a system that is future-proofed. It needs to work now, but it also needs to work in 20 years when we face stark demographic challenges, and that requires us to make accurate and realistic projections about likely need and funding sources. And it requires us to think of the entire system, so it's not just about funding, but it's also about workforce, it's about informal care and other elements of the system we need to think of. And as we've seen here in England, social care reform is unfortunately quite a politically toxic topic. It's often taking place within election cycles. And one problem is, like, public awareness in England is quite low. A lot of people think that social care is free, as is the NHS. If you just click through, Natasha. So unfortunately, attempts to raise money through taxation have often been rendered with things like death tax or dementia tax, and it's been quite politically problematic to try to reform the system within these election cycles. So yeah, there are a couple of questions we need to ask, and a couple of principles we've identified we think is important. So that's about raising money now and in the future. Risk pooling, we believe, is an essential factor. Fairness, and whether it's understandable to the public. So we need to think about what kind of system we want here, what fits in our context. And here are a couple of questions for thought, and it will be interesting to see how these develop in our panel discussion and in people's individual thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. That was very interesting. Our next speaker is Nina Hemmings, who is also a researcher at the Nuffield Trust. She joined us early in 2018 and has worked on a range of issues spanning primary care, social care, innovation and workforce. She's part of our social care team, and she has a particular interest in the workforce in health and social care, and a particular interest also in immigration. Today, she's going to be reflecting on the challenges and learning that we can take from the experience of other countries. Nina, over to you.
Thanks, Natasha. So I'd like to set out in this very short talk some of the key workforce challenges in social care and the current policy landscape in England. I'd like to briefly look at two potential solutions which have often been held up in the debate. First is professionalisation and the second is international recruitment. And then I'll end by looking to the future with some conclusions about the extent to which these are possible solutions. So to start with the key workforce challenges, these will be no surprise to any of you, I'm sure, as they're often frequently cited, and the statistics refer to England specifically, but it's worth reiterating just the sheer scale of the problems in the social care workforce. We're all aware of the chronically high vacancy and turnover rates compared to other sectors, and at the Nuffield Trust last year, our research looking at the ELSA dataset estimated that in order to provide just 2 hours of home care to people aged 65 and older who need help with 3 or more activities of daily living, England would need an additional 90,000 extra domiciliary care workers. And that's just one measure of one minimum estimate of the shortages in our formal workforce. And of course, not only has the current pandemic exacerbated many of these long-standing challenges, it's drawn a renewed public and political attention and focus to these. Thanks, Natasha. So what's being done to address these challenges so far in England? Of course, government's immediate focus has been on PPE testing and ensuring a safe working environment for care workers. But as we all know, their efforts to date have been met with much criticism from both the sector and the media about the delay in acting. And the response, of course, has varied across the 4 nations as well. And this is something that we'll return to in the discussion. And in terms of the policy landscape, just in England alone, I've picked out a few features. Notably, we've had a lack of funding reform, although we continue to watch this space. We've had an announcement of a national recruitment campaign to attract a target of 20,000 new care staff, although it's worth noting that previous recruitment campaigns and this current campaign, that there's been no evaluation of these, so we don't know how effective they are. We've had an announcement of a care brand by the Secretary of State, and notably we have a workforce strategy for the NHS, but we currently don't have one for social care. And in fact, I think the last strategy for social care was put out in 2009, so well over a decade ago. And in the absence of further funding to boost domestic recruitment, I'd like to focus on 2 policy areas which, over the last year in particular, have garnered a lot of attention as possible solutions. The first being professionalisation and the second being international recruitment. And we can consider what we might be able to learn from other countries on these. So to start with professionalisation, what does it even mean? I think it varies depending on who you speak to, and of course varies by UK nation as well. And typically I think the definition specifically relates to care workers, and it includes the concepts of registration, regulation and a protected title. But of course it's not just limited to these things. Typically advocates of this talk about 2 distinct policy objectives, one around improving safety and keeping those workers who are deemed unsuitable out of the workplace, and secondly around improving skills and a focus on professional workforce development. There seems to be a kind of cyclical nature in the way that it pops up in political debate, and notably in 2009 in England, government were due to implement it, but then abandoned this due to cost. As a solution, it raises a lot of considerations about design. So, for example, would a registration fee that's set too high or standardised minimum qualifications that are deemed too onerous actually deter the very people we want to recruit and attract into the workforce from entering at all? Thanks, Natasha. So the extent to which this solution really is a silver bullet to all of those challenges that I set out on the first slide, I think is still debatable. There's a lot that England can learn from the other 4 nations, and I think this is sort of a matter of watching this space in terms of what we might be able to learn over the coming years. At Nuffield Trust, we've tried to scope out the existing published evidence on the effectiveness of professionalisation. And this is still ongoing, but so far it seems that there's been only one formal evaluation to date, and that was carried out by the Department of Health in Northern Ireland in 2017, which showed that 68% of the public agreed that registration of social care staff will improve the quality of social care. Some other evidence that we've drawn on has been our work on Germany, which Laura outlined. We heard from our interviewees that many of the long-term care workers in Germany are actually highly qualified with 1 to 3 years of occupational training. And if we think about the assumptions behind professionalisation, you might assume that with this high level of training and a long history of sectoral collective bargaining in Germany, we'd expect to see a real boost in terms of the pay and status of the care workforce in Germany. But we heard from our interviewees that actually care work isn't seen as a particularly attractive profession for many of the same reasons as in England. So low pay, perceived low status, the emotional and physical demands of the work. So actually I think this leads us to think that professionalisation might be part of the solution in future, but only as part of a broader suite of measures to address all those challenges comprehensively. And some recommendations by various stakeholders include things like better enforcement of national minimum wage, addressing 0 hours contracts, and things such as minimum commissioning costs that take account of staff wages. Thanks, Natasha. The second area I'd like to consider is international recruitment. As of next year, it's expected that the UK will be facing the end of free movement of labour from the EU. What's more, government's proposals for the new immigration system set out that there will be some kind of fast-track visa, but no route for so-called low-skilled workers. And it's critical that changes to the immigration system help rather than hinder social care. And our research looking at countries such as Australia, New Zealand and Canada, which have long had points-based immigration systems, suggests that the UK is going to need some kind of route that works for care workers, whether that is a temporary worker visa, such as Australia and New Zealand schemes, an occupation-specific visa, which has been trialled in Canada, some kind of backdoor or de facto route, such as spousal visas or holidaymaker visas, or perhaps even a more formal sector agreement. And we might look to New Zealand for an example of this, where their government made this a priority for this year, 2020, offering more generous visa terms for care workers in exchange for plans to boost domestic recruitment and attract workers from among the New Zealand population into social care. Thanks, Natasha. So, of course, these different routes raise many different considerations that the UK government would need to take into account, particularly when considering how to make any route ethical in terms of recruitment. So we might ask questions around conditions on any visa, the flexibility of any visa, what kind of entitlements workers would be given access to, and their well-being and sustainability of these schemes. So just give one example, Canada and Japan have both trialled offering permanent residency to workers. And if, for example, if the UK were to offer this, would we want to put a cap on places in order to ensure the sustainability of such a scheme? I think that ultimately international recruitment is going to be part of a solution, both now and in future, particularly in the absence of any long-term funding settlement to boost domestic recruitment. And our research looking at other countries suggests that the UK, it's likely we're going to be competing for the same staff as other countries, but with a much reduced offer. So to conclude, I think, like how Laura reiterated, we're going to need a more formal workforce strategy that's part of a broader vision of reform from the outset. Professionalisation might play a part in that, but only when combined with other levers to really comprehensively address those workforce challenges. And ultimately, I think we are going to continue to rely on international recruitment into the long term for as long as there is no funding settlement on the horizon. Thanks.
Thank you, Nina. That was really interesting. Our next speaker I'd like to introduce is Professor Sue Yendall. Sue is Professor of Sociology at the University of Sheffield and the Director of CIRCLE, the Centre for International Research into Care, Labour and Equalities. And she's the Principal Investigator on CIRCLE's flagship programme, Sustainable Care, Connecting People and Systems. Today, Sue's going to be drawing on her extensive experience of social care, and she's going to be focusing on unpaid carers and reflecting on the role that they could or should play in a new system. Over to you, Sue.
Thank you, Natasha. So if we could move on to the next slide. I think we need to begin by thinking about who carers are and what they contribute. So on this slide, you can see that carers at any one point in time represent around 17% of the population over age 16. And what that means in effect is that actually it's a normal experience for almost everyone at some point in their lives to become a carer at some point. At a snapshot point, 58% of carers are women, which means 42% of them are men. So this is quite a widely spread responsibility that people take on. But notably, we know that almost 2/3 of carers themselves have some illness, disability or long-term condition. So this is something that needs to be borne in mind. We also know that caring is concentrated, particularly in the middle years of life, but when people are usually still in employment or would normally be expected to be. And we know that over 2 million people care for 20 or more hours a week, which is quite an intensive additional responsibility. The balance on gender shifts in later life, and when we're talking about caring amongst the very old, it's actually men who are more likely to be caring for their wives than vice versa. And you can see on the right-hand side of the slide the kinds of contributions that carers make, and this is based on a representative sample of carers across England. You can see that the majority of carers are providing practical help and keeping an eye on the person they look after, but also vitally keeping them company, which is a way of helping to avoid the loneliness and isolation, which I think is a national concern. They also help with a lot of practical issues, including helping people to access care services and understand how they might access benefits. And quite strikingly, almost 1 in 4 people are helping with aspects of personal care. And although carers care for somebody with whom they're already in a relationship, usually because they are a family member or because they are already a friend of that person, taking on the personal care of someone changes that relationship, whatever that relationship is. So this is something also to be borne in mind. So next slide, please, Natasha. The prevalence of providing unpaid care is not uniform across geography. So you can see in the map here the concentration in parts of the country where we know that there are particular types of socioeconomic deprivation and particular other variables. The key factors in the likelihood that there will be a high level of care provided include the age structure of the local population, the geographical differences in the level of socioeconomic deprivation, and patterns of health and illness. And I would emphasise that the age structure particularly really is to be looked at from the point of view of how useful it is. And this is one of the reasons why in parts of London, for example, we see rather low levels of caring, because some populations are by definition rather young and attract people in a particular stage of life. And that's more important in some ways than the elderly end of the age structure. But socioeconomic deprivation is a very important indicator of where high levels of care will be required. Can we move to the next slide, please? So who do carers care for? And I think this is really important to understand. So if we look at all carers providing any type of care and for any length of time on a regular basis, so whatever number of hours a week they provide, we can see that a high proportion, 44% in total, care for somebody in the generation above them, their parent, their parent-in-law, a grandparent. And that about a quarter, just over a quarter, care for their spouse or partner. And we see that almost 1 in 10 are caring for a friend or neighbour. So we are seeing caring happening in communities and as part of local and friendship relationships, as well as part of family life. But when we look at people who are caring more intensively, and I take that measure as 20 hours per week, you can see that actually caring for a spouse or partner comes up really highly. And of course, that form of care is usually co-resident. So you're normally living with that person, and that's a really important part of understanding about care. So for those caring more intensively, it's caring for a partner, a parent, or a child. And of course, that child may be an adult requiring long-term support right into their own middle and later life. We also know that 30% of care outside of the carer's household is care for friends and neighbours and other relatives. So we are seeing a responsibility which is picked up quite widely in our communities. Thanks, Natasha. So how do carers experience England's current social system? Well, there's a very complicated and detailed story to be told here, but I think it can be summed up in the triple penalty, which I often speak about. That carers typically find that by caring they reduce their income from earnings or pensions, and that's partly because of dropping out of work or reducing hours of work. They are likely to have poorer mental and physical health, and there are restrictions in their lives on family relationships, which affect family relationships, affect their work, their education opportunities and their leisure activities. So this is a triple penalty, which when I speak about it, I often say, I think we could all agree probably is an unfair penalty to pay for a contribution that you're freely making. How do we support carers in our current system? Well, not very extensively. There's one benefit and a few other detailed elements of other benefits, but principally we provide a carer's allowance at a low level for people who have low personal income from work. And that income has to be very low. So most people who get carer's allowance are outside the labour market, and quite a large number of those who are officially entitled to carer's allowance don't actually get any payment for it because they are over pension age. So that's in our social security system. Through local authorities, which was explained in one of the earlier presentations, we know is where much of the social care support is provided in this country. Carers assessment were introduced in the 1990s and were strengthened in very important ways in the Care Act 2014. But as I'll show in a moment, the promise of that development hasn't really been realised. We do have local authorities offering some carer-specific services, but as you'll see in the next slide, those are not really touching many carers. So the primary thing that local authorities are helping carers with is in providing some support for the person cared for, but even that isn't the experience of all carers. So a lot of carers are caring alone, something which many people think is not acceptable. And of course, as was explained at the beginning in the first presentation, local authority support is both needs and means tested. Can we move on to the next slide? So this is the slide which really, I think, explains how very little we're actually doing for carers in our current system. If you look at the figure for the total number of carers supported by local authority in 2018-19, you can see that figure's gone down over the previous, over the 3-year period, but that's just shy of 346,000 people. And yet we know from the census and the uprating we did on those figures in 2015 that there are close on 6 million people in England who are carers, and we know that 1.3, probably now more than that, probably 1.4, 1.5 million people are caring for 50 hours a week, and yet only 345,000 people are getting support. And if you look at the number there who are only getting information and advice, which is around half of that figure, slightly over half, you can see that we're really doing very little for carers at all. Do you move on to the next slide? So with international researchers on care, and this slide's based on an international analysis from Australia, Canada and the UK, we've come up with this framework of support that we think carers need for if we're to have a sustainable system. Carers underpin the system, and this is widely accepted by health and social care professionals and indeed by policymakers. So what is the framework of support that they need? And I think it's shown clearly in this slide. You need carer recognition and rights in your system. You'll need some legislation that frames that, and you'll need that to become a really clear expectation that carers are valued and respected and included in all that you do around health and social care. There need to be services for people who require support, users, as they're referred to briefly here, and for carers. And that support needs to be affordable and accessible and flexible. And that's something which is clearly missing from our current system where carers are concerned. You need policies around work-care reconciliation, because the vast majority of your carers are going to be people of working age. And so if you're going to mitigate the damaging aspects of caring in relation to work, you need to have policies which support that. And you need, for those who are going to face financial costs which they can't manage, or whose lifestyles will be significantly affected, you are always going to need some financial support. But the reason that's at the top of that pyramid is because it can be kept manageable if you get the rest of it right. And so that would be a key point that I would emphasise there. I'd also mention, before we move on to the next slide, that of course charities and NGOs have been really important in bringing these issues to the fore in the English system. England has the oldest carers organisation in the world, and there's been lobbying on this now for nearly 60 years. Yet, government hasn't really taken on this issue of its own accord. It's often been pressed into or encouraged through private members' bills and carers organisations to move forward. So we've had a lot of piecemeal development, which the Care Act 2014 was meant to consolidate. We could move to the next slide. So I want to just say a little bit about combining caring with paid work. And this is based on an international analysis of 8 countries, which I was commissioned to do by a ministry within the German system a few years ago. And that international analysis showed, I concluded, that working carers need 4 types of support. They need care leave options, and those need to be paid and probably some maybe unpaid, but you need some paid care leave options in your system. You need flexible working options, and you need 2 types of those. Types which provide the worker with salary stability, and types which allow them to have a reduced hours or workload, and you need them to have choice about that. You need job protection and return to work guarantees, and ours are quite weak in relation to this, but it's very important that caring doesn't jeopardise people's careers or job security or promotion prospects. And you need pension and employment insurance protections so that carers do not lose work-related benefits. So again, if you could just move on to the next slide, Natasha, I just want to say a few things about caring in later life, beyond working age. And long-term caring among older carers, who are people aged 50 plus in my analysis, is associated with reduced life satisfaction, a decline in the carer's quality of life, and higher levels of self-reported depression. This is clearly not something which it's acceptable for us to ask large numbers of people year in, year out to experience. And we need to address that as a very important issue in our system. And then moving on to the next slide, I just want to emphasise that long-term caring and caring intensively for long periods is not that uncommon. And if you think about the situation of parents of a disabled son or daughter, husbands and wives caring for a spouse with long-term illness, that's an experience I have in my own family, because my brother-in-law has cared for my sister now for 40 years, who has multiple sclerosis and is now severely disabled. Carers of people with mental illness, carers of people with dementia, these are long-term commitments which people take on. And yet the publicly funded support for such carers in England compares really poorly in international analyses. And you can see on the right a quote from the Caring and Family Finances Inquiry, which was undertaken a few years ago, in which a carer of her own son talks about the huge personal costs which that has meant her family have had to pay. And just to my last slide now, please, Natasha. Policies to support carers. English local authorities' statutory role in the Care Act 2014 looked extremely promising, and on paper it looks like a good development, but it has not been effective. And there are a number of reasons for that, which include the extraordinary period of austerity and financial pressure that local authorities experienced as this act was intended to be implemented, but also include government's decisions not to implement all of it. But carers need timely and ongoing advice, they need practical help, and we know what kind of help that is. And in the work that I've referred to at the bottom, which you can access through the link that I did with Andrea Wigfield a few years ago, we did some very detailed work funded by the Department of Health to look at the practical help that benefited carers. We need employment policies that support them to combine work and care, and they need financial help, and they need emotional and bereavement support. And we can see from the COVID experience how important some of those aspects may be. So just to finish, if you could just move to the final slide, please, Natasha. I'd just like to sum up by saying that the programme which I lead and which Patrick on the panel is also part of is trying to grapple with the range of issues which are important for sustaining care in our system. Understanding the role of carers and making sure that we support that for the future is going to be an absolutely pivotal aspect of that. And if we put too much burden on carers that they cannot sustain, then we will actually undermine this whole strategy that we might otherwise be putting into place. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sue, for that thought-provoking presentation. Thank you to all our speakers. Now I'd like to introduce our two panellists, Patrick Hall and Camille Ong. Patrick is a research associate in the Sustainable Care team at the University of Sheffield, and he has many years' experience in the health and social care research world. His work with the Circle team focuses on the UK's 4 countries and examines how the social care systems in the 4 countries have developed and diverged since devolution. Camille is a researcher at the Nuffield Trust. She joined us in 2018, having completed an MSc in Global Health and Development at LSE, and she quickly developed an interest in social care. She's part of the team at the Nuffield who's been looking at funding proposals for social care and has recently completed a series of explainers looking at the social care systems in the 4 countries of the UK. So over to you two.
Thanks, Natasha. So Patrick and I are going to be reflecting me from a more kind of looking at the divergences between the 4 social care systems across the UK, and Patrick's going to provide more of a reflective overview of those differences. And to start with funding, so comparing England with the rest of the UK, England is, to be fair, the least generous in terms of spending per head. And Scotland particularly has much higher levels. So for comparison, England has about £303 per head, whereas Scotland 428. The spending in the other countries is allocated through the Barnett formula and then given to local authorities in Scotland and Wales and to the Health and Social Care Trust in Northern Ireland. But there is a limit then to the extent to which there is leeway, because it's dependent on the grant given by the Barnett formula. There are also some differences in the way that people access care across the 4 countries. So even though all of the countries operate a means test, the different countries have differences in eligibility and in generosity. So we speak quite often of free personal care in Scotland, which is accessible for all adults, not just older aged adults. In Wales, there's a higher limit to the means test, so of £50,000 compared to the 23,250 that Laura was mentioning earlier. And they also have a weekly cap on care for non-residential care costs, which is capped at £90 per week. And Northern Ireland operates free domiciliary care. Patrick, do you want to reflect on those differences?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a bit about the Barnett formula. I mean, it's still kind of widely seen as quite a poor mechanism for fund allocation from a lot of different perspectives. But I think it particularly can be seen as a poor mechanism when we talk about responding to care demand, as it doesn't take account for needs. It doesn't take account of the huge regional diversity that Sue pointed to. And many still see the formula as overly generous to Scotland. And even within Scotland, it can be seen as unfair, as it penalises Scotland for its higher per head expenditure, as it allocates cash increases per head. So I think it's just worth saying, kind of given the incredibly toxic politics around funding reform, these kind of easy claims of divergent kind of generosity in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland can be seen as more rhetorical, given their kind of limited tax raising powers and the reliance on the central government UK allocation. So I think at this point, without kind of broader constitutional and funding reform, you know, a funding settlement would have to be UK wide, or real devolution would have to be enabled for us to see a kind of divergent approach to both the politics and the technicalities of funding reform.
Thanks. And now reflecting a little bit on the workforce aspects of the 4 countries and Nina's presentation. I think one of the main differences is that England is the only country of the 4 countries that doesn't have a non-departmental public body responsible for the registration, regulation and training of workers. Whereas in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, there is this organisation, regulatory body, and this legislates for the compulsory registration of workers. Despite this, there are still shared problems around recruitment and retention of the workforce. So there's a kind of question about the extent to which registration on its own can have effect on these issues. And we often heard when we were conducting our explainer analysis that registration is an important step, but not a panacea. So there are advantages that have been noticed, as Nina referred to, in Northern Ireland in terms of assurances of quality to both workers and the people that they care for. But there was also a need for more training and structured professional development opportunities, which perhaps also do have a benefit from having regulatory bodies as bodies that can directly enact policy around social care workers. And you see, for example, in Scotland, the development of the Enhanced Leadership Capability Programme to give a more kind of career pathway within social care.
Mm. Yeah, I guess some reflections from our work interviewing stakeholders across the UK's 4 nations, kind of senior stakeholders and policymakers. I guess one of the conclusions that we've started drawing is that there's an emerging tension between perspectives on this question of formalisation. So kind of a set of norms around what should be done in policy, which prioritise kind of state-driven oversight of care, compulsory registration, tougher regulation, and kind of centrally driven integration, those kind of tough standards around eligibility assessment. And that is kind of in tension, we'd say, with an approach which would favour, I suppose, more partnership commissioning, more personalisation, asset-based approaches to assessment and eligibility, and the promotion of kind of less formal, smaller scale provision, micro enterprises, community catalysts, shared lives, home share are some examples of that. And I think those different narratives have different power and influence over the potential trajectories of the 4 nations in the future. And I think it's a debate which is worth keeping an eye on. I think it on both registration and immigration, it's important to see them in context. It's not just important to kind of count the number of social care jobs that we need to deliver a kind of narrowly defined set of tasks. But maybe we should be asking the question, you know, what kind of jobs do we need for a care system? What, you know, in which types of organisations, and how do we facilitate, you know, which types of jobs, which types of organisations facilitate self-determination, independence and well-being for older and disabled people, and how do we fund that system, as opposed to just kind of seeing either registration, formalisation, or a much more liberal approach to immigration as being a kind of silver bullet. I think those things should be serving the aims of, you know, having good social care and a good social care system, however far off that might seem.
Yeah, and I think the difference that you note between diverging narratives is also something that reflects on the informal care workforce and Sue's presentation. And I think there is a heavy reliance on informal carers, but perhaps in different ways and using different narratives across the 4 countries of the UK. And I mean, you can see, you know, the most comparable source of carer numbers across the UK is the census, but Scottish Household Survey counts 800,000 compared to the 492,000 from the census, and so there is clearly a difference in the way that that definitions of what a carer is and how care is given to, and to whom is quite clear, and also clear in the legislation. And there's also similar differences in the kind of initiatives that are given. So Scotland has the Carers Allowance Supplement, which is designed to bring in line the Carers Allowance with the Job Seekers Allowance, to kind of recognise the economic kind of value of caring. And in fact has also been increased in the current situation with COVID to recognise the kind of importance of informal carers to keep the system sustainable.
I think it's interesting. I mean, just drawing on what Sue was talking about in terms of the relationship between the ageing population and the propensity of unpaid care across the four nations. I think Northern Ireland's an interesting case then, you know, in that it has probably the highest levels of unpaid care across the UK, and yet it has the youngest population, you know. So I think that's an interesting kind of different case, and I think, you know, it's important for us to think that, you know, that actually it's not just demographically driven, but it's kind of part of, you know, a kind of multifactorial process, and, you know, which is partly about a persistent national cultural difference as well, related to, I mean, lots of different things. But it for our interviewees, it's kind of seen quite ambivalently, sometimes seen as kind of community and family strength, and then sometimes seen as kind of being behind the curve in some way. And I think that links again, as you were saying, Camille, between the tension between this promotion of a, you know, a formal, controlled from the centre social care system, and one that values kind of informality and community assets. And I think it'd be interesting to see how the differences between the four nations in that respect play out in future policy development.
Thank you both for those excellent reflections. I want to move us in now to a bit of a Q&A with our panel. So I'm just going to start with a couple of questions. So thank you, all our speakers. I'd now like to just open up for a few questions. And Laura, I was really interested in your reflections on Germany. You talked about how the social care debate here quickly becomes politically toxic. What was different about Germany? And do you think the COVID crisis at the moment might be the catalyst that reunification was for Germany in their reform?
Okay, I think what with Germany was quite interesting, as you just said, is that it was the time where economically and politically things were quite unstable, interestingly enough. So in that sense, I mean, we don't know what a pandemic recession means. But at the time in Germany, there was recession, there was high unemployment, and that brought up a lot of social issues that weren't talked about before. And we see that with COVID now as well, that social care is getting a lot of the attention it didn't get before. It's something that the public is becoming more aware of. So those are definitely, I think, could be opportunities we could seize for reform. I think what also helped in Germany was pressure from different sides. It was the local authorities who had to pay for social care and for reunification, so they had increased burden. It was the public that put pressure on politicians, and it was the experts. And again, that's something that we're seeing here now, that different charities and experts, think tanks coming together to highlight the issues. So I think what is important is that we need to be realistic as to what can be achieved. Obviously, once we come out of this pandemic, there will not be a lot of money available. So we need to start small and we need to build our way up. And so yeah, I think it's definitely, it could be an opportunity, but what we need is strong political leadership. That's something that helped in Germany, and cross-party cooperation.
Yeah, thank you. And on that, you mentioned now, obviously we're moving into recession. And Nina, I was just wondering, given that we're likely to move into quite a deep and long-term recession, how relatively important do you think immigration will be, given that we're likely to have a pool of unemployed domestic staff, potential staff? What do you think?
I think that's a really good question, and it's certainly one that's up for debate depending on what your stance is. We've heard a lot anecdotally about how certain social care providers might see recessions as gold dust, I think was the phrase they used, with evidence that, for example, some people who've been furloughed recently as a result of the pandemic have found themselves entering social care under these circumstances. And I guess that is good news for employers who are looking to fill those recruitment gaps. But I think we do need to ask, to what extent can we rely on a recession to fully address the challenge of retention in the workforce? It might work in the short period, but it's going to be difficult to see to what extent a recession will help in the long term. And something that just struck me is that, of course, the social care and health workforces are very different, and people's motivations for entering them are different. But I don't think you'd find recession written into any, say, NHS workforce strategy. I think it would be a bit easy to rely on a recession and assume that it's going to sort out all the existing challenges that government is aware of. And you can kind of see that approach to carers as well in some of the things that Sue pointed out in her presentation. I think it would be a bit laissez-faire to rely on circumstance rather than look at the multiplicity of measures that could be done. And one of those is international recruitment, if you look at other countries and their experiences. So that was a long answer, but I'm not sure is my verdict.
Patrick, did you want to comment on that?
I just wanted to talk quickly about what's happened in Northern Ireland, and I think what we've seen is a bit more of an easy deployment of health staff into care homes during this time because of the integrated nature of the system there. And I just think that's an interesting kind of difference. I mean, it's probably too early to say evaluatively whether that's made a difference or not, but it's one key difference between the systems.
And Camille and Patrick, given your knowledge of the four systems at the moment and the current situation, do you think going forward that we're likely to see more divergence between the country of the UK on social care, or is COVID going to be the thing that brings it together towards a more nationalised approach?
It's an interesting question, and I'm not entirely sure of the answer myself. I mean, we talk a lot about, opportunities for reform and the need for reform of the English care system, and echoes of things like free personal care as it is in Scotland, and often conflated with free social care, which are two distinctive things, and the extent to which, personal care covers all of care is a bit simplistic in my view. Perhaps there may be a direction towards that way, but also I think the other nations have had quite a strong emphasis on well-being as policy has progressed over the last few years, and I think have, in my perspective, perhaps been a little bit more proactive at recognising that within the social care sector over the course of the pandemic. And Scotland, for example, very early on placed social care at the centre of the reform, and has done things like increase the carers allowance supplement, as well as pay for workers. So it's going to be interesting, certainly.
Sue, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm not terribly optimistic about I mean, this is clearly a moment. It's clearly a very important historical moment for this issue to move in a direction or another. But I'm quite worried, because I think there's a risk that rather than, there hasn't been a lot of attention and a lot of discussion about what's happening to carers and how difficult their lives have become during the crisis, even more difficult than they were before. And the focus has been primarily upon the NHS, and then latterly on residential care, which is a small minority of people that require help. So what's happened is that carers have been, they've stepped up, and I think there'll be a worry that government will think, well, they can do it during a crisis, they'll carry on doing it. And we assumed that carers will just somehow keep going, and I think that would be deeply dangerous. So I think it's really important that there's, that some sort of coalition is formed across the various voices that need to be raised in relation to care. So that's, because the voices have been raised already. There's been plenty of people saying that social care needs reform. It's not exactly something that people have been silent about, but they've got to come together, and they've got to come together and really push for this, because I think there'll be a real temptation for government to say, we've got so many other problems we've now got to deal with, that this one, we'll do this and we'll do that and we'll do the other, and then we've done it. And all they'll do will be some piecemeal bits and pieces around the things they've been speaking about, which will be around the selling your home because you're going into residential care, which is one very small element of a very complicated and large problem.
I think that's the key danger, is that social care is increasingly defined very narrowly in terms of, both in terms of a narrow funding, an individual narrow funding issue as identified, but also as, a narrow set of tasks which are performed in care homes for older people, when actually it's an incredibly diverse and, large sector and, part of our civil society. So I think that's the real danger, is that the politics of this become focused very, very narrowly. I mean, you've already seen, as part of the Care Act easement, a radical stripping back of the duties on local authorities on their basic functions of assessment and review, let alone the other kind of Care Act duties about the promotion of well-being, preventative services, in England and Wales at least, which have quite similar legislative environments. Some local authorities really kind of almost immediately scrapped some of their duties, whereas others have seen them as more of a last resort. I think, the real danger is that across the board, COVID enables local authorities to kind of strip back their operations, exacerbating unmet need, and kind of facilitates a retreat on these broader aspirations of the social care system, which are in the Care Act and in similar legislation across the UK. If you were going to be more optimistic, you might look at some of the really positive stories of community solidarity in care that have happened during lockdown. And I think, everyone's got personal stories of, the strength of neighbourhood care and of volunteering and solidarity that's come out as part of this. And I think, there are real dangers, but there are opportunities if the sector, people who understand the sector are willing to kind of to really engage with the opportunities that might open up once the lockdown's over.
Yeah, thank you all. I'm afraid I'm going to have to draw us to a close because we're out of time. So I'd just like to say thank you to all our participants for sharing your knowledge and for that really interesting debate. I think on that last point, I think we have got an opportunity ahead of us here to really change the system, and it's important that we don't lose that. And I think what I've heard from everything I've heard today is that there's a huge amount to take away from the experience of different countries, and that we need to build on that learning and adopt and adapt it to suit our context. I think that's really the contextual part of this is so important in building a system, creating a vision for a system that suits our context. And as Patrick was just saying, they're getting that balance between the kind of the local strengths, but then the national strengths as well, and creating a sustainable system on those building blocks. And I think what's clear to me is that what we don't need now is another set of piecemeal reforms or just to talk about the funding of the system, but we need a comprehensive reform to the entire system to make sure it's fit for purpose and meeting our needs. So thank you very much.